his name. And I was, my Bible upside down, better turn around. Thinking about different things that happened, and been thinking about Moses in the Bible, and different things that happens to us, and sometimes why in the world that happened, you know? And about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a young man, 17, 18 years old. He was going up the road. That was real early one morning, and he ran off the road, and he hit another guy. I still don't know who it was. Had no idea, but not too far from the road from where I live, and the guy run off the road. He come back on, hit that other guy head on. He burned up in the car, killed him. They took the other guy to the hospital, but I don't know what happened to him. But you never know. And I was thinking about, I was coming up the ridge in the tractor one time and blocked a little bit getting up to the main road, and I was about 100 foot maybe from the road. My hat blew off. So I stopped and got off the tractor. About the time I got off the tractor, I heard this commotion. I looked up. These two boys come up the road. They was racing. They were in pickup trucks. And there's a curve up there, up from my mom's house. Joey knows where it is. They swapped. I don't know how they have done it. They swapped lanes. One of them went over right in front of the tractor and over in the field. And the other guy, he made it. He went on up the road. And this guy went over the field. He kept spinning, and directly he come out of there and back down the road he went. And if my hat hadn't blown off, I'd been right in the middle of that. I was almost in the middle of it. But you know, things happen like that, and you don't really realize that He's in control. And we sometimes we don't give him credit. Yes, what I was trying to say. We don't give him credit for the things he does. And I was thinking about Moses, and if you get to studying about Moses, it's very interesting. And you know, he was Pharaoh was having all the male children killed, and his mom hid him, and Pharaoh's daughter found him, and you know, and raised him, and he was raised in a palace, and he was raised in the palace of Pharaoh. He was had all the conveniences of home, or something, all the luxuries, I guess I'm trying to say. Had he was taught, you know, a different schooling, had a high education, had you know, anything he wanted. And he was, if you study that, he was there for 40 years. And then at the end of 40 years, he was out and he was looking around, and he seen this. If you turn in Exodus, chapter 2 and 3 and 4, but in Exodus, I think it's in chapter 2, he seen this. He killed this Egyptian, and he thought he hit him, but somebody seen him, and they told Pharaoh. And anyway, Pharaoh wound up in chapter 2 and verse 15 says, "Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian." But that was God's way of getting him away from the palace and getting him out of there. Had I was reading this article about a little devotion book about Moses. It says, Moses, the child of a slave, grew up in all the luxury of Egyptian palace. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out into his brethren and looked up on their burdens, and he spied Egyptians smiting Hebrew on one of his brethren, and he looked this way and that way, and he saw that there was no man, and he slew the Egyptians and hid him in the sand. And that was in Exodus 2 and verses 11 and 12. This was his legal right, since he was second only to Pharaoh. Moses would have been the leader when Pharaoh died. You know, sometimes we didn't think about that, but he had he would have been the ruler, but God, that wasn't in God's plan, and that's the reason God got him away from that. And read some of this other. Says he was there for 40 years, and then the next 40 years he was a shepherd. When after he killed that guy, and Pharaoh found out about it, Pharaoh was going to kill Moses, and so Moses fled, and he wound up. God took care of him, and he wound up in what was the backside of the desert, or he was in a forbidden place. Like he was a shepherd. Said it was an imperative that Moses go to the backside of the desert, and that was in Exodus chapter 3, for the next 40 years, and then to meet God for his mission. At Moses' first encounter with God, he was told, put off your shoes from your feet, for this place where you stand is holy ground. Moses could never learn to draw nigh to God in Egypt. He was too busy, he was too important, too popular, and he was next in line to be Pharaoh. So God put him in the backside of the desert, and he instructed him for the next 40 years. And lots of times things happen to us, and God is trying to instruct us. Sometimes we don't understand what's happening to us, but God knows, and God is, sometimes he instructs us to things, and we don't understand it. And it's very interesting in the Exodus, and if you get a chance to read chapters 2 and 3 and 4 there, and it tells you all about Moses and how God instructed him and how he dealt with him to get him away from the palace and get him away from things of Pharaoh. And if he stayed there in the palace, he would have been like Pharaoh. And but God got him away from that. And but that's really interesting to read that and to see how God works. And God works in our lives the same way. And lots of times things happen to us, and we don't, maybe we don't like it, we don't understand it, but God knows, and be according to God's will. And lots of times things happen to us. It's like that guy, some guys come up the road racing, and I've been a few feet further, they would hit me. And but anyway, things like that does happen, and we need to think about that, think about how God deals in our lives and how he instructs us. Sometimes we don't like it, but God God knows what's best for us. Read that, you'll get a lot out of it. Been much in prayer for our service today. Brother Ellis has bring some message to us. And, all those that's on the prayer list. I don't know exactly all of them, but know that God knows them. And He'll deal with each and every one of them. And let's stand and be dismissed in the class. Joey, are you on dismiss us, please?
If I scream, you know why. No, not going Pentecostal, just a spider. Well, it's good to be in the Lord's house. Good to see each one of you that's out. I haven't been exactly sure what to teach on since we finished Exodus, and still not exactly sure. But if you would turn with me to Matthew chapter 5, I have some different ideas. Some people mentioned some things, but in the process, this is something I've been looking at the Beatitudes, and I don't know if we'll go through them all, but this week I had been looking at reading them and reading the Sermon on the Mount, and have been looking at that some. So we're going to start with this first Beatitude read here in Matthew chapter 5, and look at that for at least this week. If you would, we'll read the beginning in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And looking at this, and specific at these Beatitudes, the first thing that we see here is Jesus. I threw this note in first just to start off with as kind of a preface to it, but Jesus is not teaching how to become a Christian. This is not how to be saved. This is not how to come to him. He's not teaching how to become a Christian. He is showing us the things that define a Christian, how a Christian is defined, and it's not to do these things to become a Christian, but rather this describes the Christian. It describes those that have had a change of heart, that have come to be children of God. And so we're going to see here in all these that each one of these Beatitudes shows how the Christian, how they live, how they think, how they operate. And this basically is going to be, these verses are going to define what a Christian looks like. And we're going to see that when the Christian looks at everything a little different. We're going to see that this, to his audience, we see here that the multitudes came to him. And so I'm sure there were those in the audience who were Pharisees, those who had ideas of what they thought true religion was. But we're going to see that Jesus looked at this very differently. This would have been very shocking to his audience, I'm sure. And the Christian, we are to look at everything a little different. We see the world differently after we have been saved. And as we see things differently, as we're going to see here, the attitudes that we should have, the things that define us in these first 11 verses, or even more than that, really, because the Sermon on the Mount continues that throughout this whole entire chapter, continues that reveal a different way of looking at the world that only the Christian has, because we've been saved and because we have this same worldview that Christ himself had. But we see things differently, and then we act accordingly. We act differently too. And this passage here beginning in Matthew chapter 5 is the first sermon that we have that Jesus preached. It wasn't his first sermon. We know if you looked back in the first couple chapters of Matthew, we see that it would say that Jesus was walking and he would tell people to repent, for the kingdom is at hand. He had already been preaching, but this is the first passage where we have a sermon that Jesus preached specifically. And so this was not his first sermon, but the first one that is recorded. And so it's probably safe to say that this is the greatest sermon ever. This is what God willed for us to have from the preaching of Jesus. This is the first sermon that we have of him. And so safe to say it's the greatest sermon ever and from the greatest preacher ever. And so we're going to look just today here at verse 1, which says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." But all the people from this whole region were coming to see Jesus, as we saw there in verse 1, seeing the multitudes. And so no doubt many people had heard about him. His fame was spreading, the fact that he had done many miracles. And he had been preaching this gospel. And people knew that he had been baptized. He was baptized by John and everything. And so they were coming to see Jesus. And he was not about to miss this opportunity to preach to them. So as the multitudes came, we see that he sat there in the mount. And it says when his disciples came unto him, he opened his mouth and he taught them these words. And so hopefully today we can look at this, and hopefully I think it's things we already know, but it's always good to go back over them and to refresh the way we look at these passages. And so this is where it all begins. When you hear he is describing the truly blessed, in these verses he is describing the true children of God. And somebody pointed out that the word blessed means happy, but ultimately when he talks about being blessed, they point out the fact that there's only two ways, and there are only two types of people in this world. There's those who have been blessed by God and those who are under the curse of God. And so when it says blessed are the poor in spirit, what it's ultimately saying is those who are poor in spirit, those who have these qualities as Christians have had the blessing of God, and the blessing of God ultimately is salvation. So when it says blessed are the poor in spirit, he is directly referring to Christians, those who have come to know the Lord and serve him, love him, keep his commandments, and know the Savior, have trusted in Jesus. And so we're going to see throughout this that only those that have done that are truly blessed. And those who have not done that, there's only, like I said, there's only two ways you can go about this. You are either blessed of God or you are under his curse, and you are cursed of God, and those who are cursed will spend eternity in hell. So we see here, Jesus begins here with verse 3, and you have to believe that this beatitude is intentionally first. I'm sure this order is Christ, who was the greatest expositor, who knew, as we said, the greatest preacher. He knew the Bible inside out, backwards. It is his word. He is the word. And so obviously this beatitude is intentionally first. And so when you think about it, you have to start with this one. Right here is blessed are the poor in spirit. When you think about that, as we look through the other ones that we just read, you can never attain to some of these other beatitudes until you are poor in spirit. You can never mourn, and you can never be meek, or you can never be truly merciful, or you can never be pure in heart, as it says there in verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart. You can never do any of these things until you have realized that you are poor in spirit, until you realize that you have nothing to offer God. As you come to him, You have no, as one person put it, I was listening to, they said, you have no spiritual capital. We have nothing that we bring to God. We are completely without merit, we have absolutely no anything spiritual or anything moral that we can bring to God and present to Him. So we have no spiritual capital. We are completely poor in spirit. And listening to Spurgeon, there's a message you can listen to on sermon audio, and it's someone reading his sermons. But he describes these Beatitudes as a ladder, and it's a good message. It's worth listening to if you have sermon audio on your phone, or if you can get that app. But he describes it as a ladder and says, you cannot get to these loftier parts of the ladder without first stepping on this first rung of the ladder. And he points out how this first beatitude is so accessible. Everybody can understand this. Everybody can look at themselves and realize that they come so far short, and that they are anyone who is being honest with themselves. We talk about how we're human, to err is human, we're not perfect, and people will say that as a sort of to defend themselves. Oh, I'm not perfect. They know they're not perfect, but we are so far from perfect. We are absolutely imperfect. We are spiritually bankrupt, and only those who have realized that, only those who have come to Jesus Christ, realizing that they bring nothing that they can bring to Him, are truly blessed. Can truly say that they have realized that they are poor in spirit. And so this Spurgeon said, if Jesus in this passage had started out by saying, "Blessed are the pure in heart," all of us would realize none of us attained to that. It would have been such a high and lofty goal. But he starts at the bottom. He starts on the bottom rung of the ladder, something that you have to first realize before any of these other things become pertinent or important, and that is that blessed are the poor in spirit. You have to realize that you have as we said, no spiritual capital. You have nothing to offer God. And also, too, Spurgeon pointed out that this is right where the law leaves us. When we looked at the Old Testament, we looked at the Ten Commandments, and we pointed out that the whole point of the Ten Commandments is to remind us that we come so far short, that we fail in every point, and that we have all sinned and all come short of the glory of God. And he says that when you come to that point and you realize, instead of being in despair, you realize that you are destitute spiritually, that there is nothing that you can bring, and that you cannot attain to God's standards. And it picks up right where the law leaves off. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who have realized that. Those of us who are saved, who have realized that, that is the way you can be truly blessed, when you realize that you are destitute spiritually and that you cannot attain to God's standards. And so where the law leaves us is right where these Beatitudes pick up. And it's almost a continuation, if you really think of it, what Christ did in this Sermon on the Mount. And so it's very specific, and it's very intentional that this is the first of the Beatitudes, describing the blessedness of the person who realizes that they are poor in spirit. And so Jesus begins here because this is where the gospel begins. This is where every person who would ever come to Jesus, who will ever realize their state, realize who they are, have to realize that they are spiritually poor. And if you're here and you're lost, you are spiritually poor. Every person in the whole entire world, that's when you think about this, is blessed are the poor in spirit. And you say, well, isn't everyone poor in spirit? But the point is here that you can be poor in spirit, and as Jesus termed it, and not realize it. But what this is a realization that you are poor in spirit. So in reality, every person in the world is poor in spirit. But blessed are those who realize that they are spiritually bankrupt, that they have nothing to offer God. And so if you're here and you're lost, you are spiritually poor, whether you know it or not, whether you understand that or not. The whole entire world is spiritually destitute before God. But the blessedness comes from realizing this fact that you can never cry out to God. You can never ask for mercy until you realize your spiritual condition. And as the song we sing, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling, that has to be the attitude of anyone who has realized that they are poor in spirit. And when we think about what we have in Jesus Christ, the blessing that we have in Him, it is only because we have realized, those that are saved, if you're here and you're saved, you've realized that you are poor in spirit, that you have nothing that you can bring except to cling to the cross of Christ and hold on to His righteousness. And so moving on though, now I don't ever like to get into the original Greek. I don't know anything about it, but I was listening to someone, and they were talking about the different words, and apparently there are more than one word in the original Greek for poor. And when you think about it, ultimately, poor is kind of a relative state. You know, what your idea of poor or rich can be vastly different than someone else's. I've talked to people before, and they were bragging about how much money they made, and then eventually they came around to telling you how much money they made. And once I was kind of impressed at first because they sound like they really made a lot of money, and then when it all comes out, it's like, well, it's really not as quite as impressive as you made it out to be. So everybody's idea of poor and rich can be vastly different. But someone who has been extremely rich at some point, or extremely poor when they move up, or if they happen to lose their money, they might still be doing better than you, but they feel poor. So and someone who's been extremely poor the same way, if they manage to move up into a better situation, then they might feel rich. But I'm told that this word here for poor doesn't just mean that you have a tough time paying your bills, or that you have a hard time making ends meet, but that this word has this connotation of being absolutely destitute, of having absolutely nothing. And you have nothing, you are lacking everything. And you have no means whatsoever of doing anything. This is being absolute destitute is the meaning of this word. And so I think that's like I said, I don't know much about the Greek, but that's what I've been told. And when you think about that, that is exactly how we are before God. And if you don't realize that, that's the first thing that you have to come to a realization of that before you can know the Lord, before you can be saved, before you can trust in the Lord, is realize that you bring nothing to the table, that you have nothing that the Lord could possibly use, because we are all absolutely poor in spirit, whether we realize it or not. I'm moving through these notes a lot faster than I usually do, so I'm going to probably let you out early. But if you would, turn with me to Luke chapter 18. We'll look at this passage. In Luke chapter 18, we get a glimpse of someone who is poor in spirit and someone who definitely is not. Luke chapter 18, beginning at verse 9. And this is Jesus, and it says, He spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. And he says, 2 men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes in the heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. When you think about this is a perfect example of someone who realizes how morally and spiritually bankrupt they are, this publican. And the Pharisee is much like many of the people in the world who feel like they have some sort of capital. They have something that they've earned or something that they've done that they can bring to God. And to think like this was revolutionary. These, when you think about the Pharisees, they were the elite Christians of the day. These people were so right-wing. I mean, they did everything exactly how they were supposed to do. And from the Old Testament, they observed every law, and yet they totally missed the point. And they were so wrapped up in what they had done that they did not realize that they had nothing to bring to God. They thought that they had so much that they could give to God and they could bring to God, and they had nothing. And so to think like this, as we're going to see in these, is radical. It's counterintuitive. It goes against everything that the human nature wants to believe about ourselves. We tend to kind of like ourselves. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but we tend to love ourselves. And this is counterintuitive to that. This is where we disdain ourselves and we realize that we have nothing. And when you think about the world that we live in even today, and it's the same back then, but it's counter to the culture as well. Today, people, when people have low self-esteem, and there's so many people in this world that have low self-esteem, and the world teaches them to love themselves and to take care of themselves and to lift themselves up, exalt themselves, and to feel self-important. And this goes completely against what we're being taught here by Jesus, that when we look at ourselves, we realize just how poor we are. We are poor in spirit. We have nothing. And So this is counterintuitive. It goes against the grain of everything that we want to believe about ourselves. And it goes against everything that our culture, and even back in this day, when we see this Pharisee, it would have gone completely against the grain of what the Pharisees would have believed too, that they had this self-importance because they followed the law so closely. But Jesus here clearly says that the publican, this one who understood he was morally bankrupt, that he had nothing to bring God, he was spiritually destitute, and he is the one who went down, as it says there in verse 14, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. And then he goes on there in verse 14, and this is where, once again, everything gets turned on its head. Everything, the Christian and the way we are to look at things, the way we view the world is almost diametrically opposed to the way the world looks at things. We see there at the end of verse 14, he says, for everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. And so we see that it's exactly the opposite of what the world would have us believe. It's exactly the opposite of what the world teaches us to think about ourselves. And there at the end of Matthew chapter 5, we won't turn back there because we'll look at this. This phrase comes up more than just once, and we'll look at this some other time hopefully. But blessed are those who realize that they are in this state of extreme spiritual poverty. If you're here and you have not realized that you're in this state of extreme spiritual poverty, we pray that you would, because this is the beginning. This is the very beginning of understanding what it is to be a Christian, what it is to follow Christ, to realize that you are morally and spiritually bankrupt before Him. And there is a reward, as we saw there, and we read it, but at the end of verse 3 there in Matthew chapter 5, it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we'll hopefully, if we get a chance, we'll look at that phrase a little more. But there is a prosperity. Even though in this life we have nothing, we realize that we are nothing. We are completely relying on Christ and on His blessing. There is a reward. There is a future where it says theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so hopefully we'll look at that. We're a few minutes early today. You'll have a little extra time to talk and fellowship. But with that, thank you for your attention. You are dismissed.